everyone, and welcome to Call Your Hits, a Storm Riders Airsoft podcast. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Today, we're going to be continuing our series on ideas and concepts that beginners should be thinking about, and other things that really aren't a factor until you gain some more experience in the sport.
I really think we should have called this Learn from the Dumb Stuff We've Done.
Absolutely.
But that actually could have been the title for the entire podcast.
And you know what? Maybe that's what I'll call it.
Wicked.
So last time, if you recall, we talked about things that you should think about when you're looking at picking up your very first airsoft gun, as well as your expectations for your first few games, and also the importance of selecting good eye protection, which again, can't really be overstated, right?
You need those eyes.
Yeah, exactly. That being said, today we thought we would look at setting some expectations with respect to airsoft guns in general, as well as some consideration about when is a good time to start looking at upgrades, both for your main rifle, but as well as the rest of your kit. And finally, what are some of the things that we think are worth prioritizing over others when you're looking at your kit in general?
And sort of like when you want to look at prioritizing what?
Yeah, totally, right? And before we dive into our conversations today, just in general, there's two things that I really want to touch on. Number one is we recognize that not everybody has the same budget for airsoft, right? Some people are able to go and buy all of their kit up front before their first game, and that's fine. And some people have to save up. And what we don't want you to take away from any of our conversations is that you need to spend money to enjoy airsoft, right? Obviously, you're going to need some gear to enjoy the sport, but going and dropping hundreds of dollars is not a requirement to both be able to perform on the field, nor is it a requirement to have fun. That being said, we do think that there are certain things that are eventually worth picking up. And if you're really serious about airsoft, it's stuff that you should be considering setting some budget aside for to pick them up. And we'll talk a little bit later about how do you make that determination on where you should spend your money and what some of that purchasing decision should look like. The other thing that I want to touch on, just before we get into anything else, is that if you're looking at stuff for airsoft and you see something that looks really cool or really fun and you want to buy it, you should definitely do that. If it's in your budget and you think it will bring you joy, then do that. We've all bought stuff for airsoft that we thought was hilarious. What we're talking about here is really your performance, what to look for when you're looking to maximize your performance and when you're trying to invest your money towards stuff that will help you maximize your performance. So again, we're not here to tell you how to have fun. We're just here to give you some ideas as to how you can best spend your money to make sure that you get the best performance out of your kit. That's all.
I mean, we played for a really long while. He's still welcome anytime, with a guy who rocks a World War II paratrooper kit and like buys the worst cigars he can to bring to the airsoft field, like just so that he can smoke an awful cigar while shooting a Thompson at people.
Yeah, and I mean, that's fun. Like we've said before, like we really just want to help you guys make good purchasing decisions and make decisions that will help really maximize your performance on the field. And for us, performing well and doing well is tied to having fun, but it's not the only factor. And there's lots of stuff that we own, both Pat and I and the rest of the team, that's just, that has nothing to do with our performance, but it's just fun to carry and it's fun to own. But if you're really looking to see like how can you maximize every dollar you spend on airsoft, that's really what we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And like we want to make sure that you're buying sort of with an eye towards some efficiency purchasing stuff and some making sure that you don't make things that we know we felt are mistakes. And that our teammates have felt our mistakes and that other players we've known for years have felt, I probably shouldn't have done that, right? And we want to make sure that as much as possible, we're giving you guys, useful, helpful, good advice.
Yeah, for sure. And a huge part of that is making sure that you understand what you're getting for your money, right? And setting that expectation of when you decide to spend, $250 on an airsoft gun, what exactly are you getting for that money? And that's really where we want to start the discussion today. So one of the things that airsofters really fail to grasp, especially initially, is that although airsoft guns look like real steel guns, they are not real steel guns, right? They are toys. And that might sting to hear that you're just playing with a toy gun or like a, a grown up version of a toy gun or a Nerf gun or whatever. But let's be very clear about something. You absolutely are playing with a toy gun. And that will come across to you in many ways, especially when you start digging into sort of what's going on under the hood.
Yeah, I mean, one of the key things to remember here is that these are, sort of simulationist toys, right? And that's their origin point, and it's really, it's where they live. I I remember really well at one point interacting with a police officer who had come to one of the fields that we were playing at, not as a like, oh, checking up on us, but just he happened to be there, and he was checking out my M4 and yanked the charging handle as hard as you would on a real one, because he'd handled a real M4 and basically tore it out of the gun.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it only actuates like a third of the way. And like it was easy to fix, except for the fact that it, totaled the spring that it was on, because it's not a real charging handle spring. It's not running an M4. It's just, a little tiny spring to make it snap back in nicely. So people look at these and go, oh man, you can handle it like a real gun. Well, a real gun is designed to stand up to extremely harsh real world conditions.
Yeah.
An airsoft gun is designed to look cool, shoot plastic BBs, and hang on a wall.
Yeah, that's right. And a lot of them have, features that mimic real world features. I remember we did a training day a few years ago now, pre-COVID, obviously, at the local field. And one of the guys came and he had an AK-47 that had a charging handle that would that would actuate, right? And so to, chamber around, you had to actuate the charging handle and all this kind of stuff. And it was really cool. But the thing is that is meant to look cool and be like a nifty feature. But throughout the training session, so after, reloading 10 or 20 times, he yanked on it so hard that he just tore it right off the gun, right? That was it. On a real AK-47, you would have a lot of trouble doing that, right? They're meant to stand up to that kind of abuse. And airsoft guns just are not. I mean, you've got airsoft guns that are shell ejecting, right? And that might seem really cool initially.
And it is.
Kind of, but like when you think about it, you can't use those at a game, because unlike a shell in the real world, I mean, unless you're collecting shells to reload them or whatever, most of the time when a shell flies out of your gun, you're not picking that up. But in airsoft, you need that because you need to shoot your gun. So you need to have some sort of like contraption on the side of your gun to catch all your shells to make sure that you can use them again later, which is kind of stupid. Like that's not really, for me anyway, that's not really fun. That's kind of, it's kind of dumb. It's kind of killing the fun of it, right?
The sad reality is, right, like we're referencing there with the shell ejecting Car 98 that one of our teammates bought and, realized he couldn't ever take to the field for a game, and it was awesome. Like, it's a really fun toy, but it has no practical value whatsoever for playing airsoft. You can't use it. Like you are gonna fire it in your basement and lose one of those shells, and the shells cost, like a couple of dollars each.
And if you think about like other ways that firearms operate, so like let's say that you're using a handgun, for example, a pistol, and like a real steel pistol, and then you rack the slide, and the slide doesn't go all the way forward, right? So you might bump the back of the slide with your fist to jam it in position. If you do that with an airsoft gun, you could break it, just flat out.
You almost certainly will break it.
Right?
Like,
same thing with like plastic bodied M4s or whatever. Like we had, I remember one game we played many years ago where a couple of people were horsing around, and one of them took their M4 and he like muzzle struck the other person's gun with it, and he just went clean through the body with the muzzle strike. Right now, it's a bit of an asshole thing to do, but the point is, if that had been a real gun, like metal on metal, like whatever, but because it's plastic and it's a little bit colder, it just cracks automatically, right?
Yep. And like the player doing that was definitely not being sensible or like engaging in what I'd consider a safe sort of approach to airsoft.
Definitely.
But the reality is, like, if you trip with an actual M4 and you catch it on a rock, when you dust yourself off, it will work pretty much fine, even if you're a big dude like me, right? If you do that with an airsoft gun, there's a chance you'll snap your gun in half,
Yeah.
right?
And that applies to all airsoft gear or gear that's marketed to airsoft. Like I've seen many times reproduction airsoft slings that you'll just use pot metal for for a loop instead of tempered steel. And what that means is because it's just pot metal, the steel will eventually like rip or deform or whatever. If it had been tempered, that would never be the case. But if it had been tempered, it also wouldn't be 1999, right? So like you really get what you pay for. These are toys. And that applies equally in terms of their durability, especially like if you look at internals and stuff, but also in how you use them, right? And so on Discord, we were talking to one of the guys on the forum, and he was saying that like his stock gun keeps locking up on semi-auto.
And I mean, that's a pretty normal thing. Your gun has a cutoff lever. It helps to actuate the trigger reset, essentially. But the thing that rocks your trigger safety is also in there, and so they can jam. It locks up. It goes, yeah, I'm not going to finish completing the trigger part of the cycle. The gun's cycled fine. Everything is working fine. You just can't literally pull the trigger through a cycle on semi. And it's the easiest thing in the world to fix. You just flip to auto and pull the trigger, and it goes back, and it resets everything back to where it's supposed to be. But as you use the gun on semi, that lever wears out. Right, it's a little piece of aluminum if you're lucky, like they're not steel, and you can get ones that are steel and they'll last way longer, but they're still, every single time your gun cycles, they're still getting tapped by the gears, so there's still a lot of wear and tear on them over time, and eventually it'll become an issue even if it isn't at the beginning of things, and the more you use semi, the more likely it is to eventually become an issue.
Yeah, especially if you're doing sort of what we recommend in a lot of our videos and our podcasts and stuff, which is you're using semi almost exclusively and you're hitting the field and you're just cranking on that trigger. Like for example, like I do when I play, right? I'm coming up on target and I'm going like bang, 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 like really quickly. But I don't have a mechanical trigger in my gun. I have an electronic trigger, and the electronic trigger can handle that. But the mechanical trigger, if I still were using one, and I did for much longer than I really care to admit, to be honest, but it can't keep up with that, right? Yeah. It's not meant to do that. And why is it not meant to do that, Pat?
Because it's a toy.
Because it's a toy.
And so, like, to give you a brief sort of user guide, what's happening when it locks like that is it's not completing the cycle fully, right? Which means that if you pull the trigger and the gun shoots, and you pull the trigger and the gun shoots, you won't run into the problem. But if you're like, literally all of us, and you're going tap, 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 give me rounds, give me rounds, it's going to eventually do this to you. And unfortunately, the reality is that, like, swapping in a non-trigger replacement FET isn't going to fix it. It does a whole bunch of things for your gun. It's really good. It does give you better trigger response, so that cycle time will happen quicker, but it won't fix the issue. It will not give you never having to worry about that happening again. Buying a really expensive, really nice FET that gives you a complete trigger replacement will absolutely do that.
Yeah.
That's pretty much the thing that you're paying the money for, honestly. Like, it's one of the big jumps in quality of feature. That and storage space essentially are the two, like, biggest changes between like a Gate FET and a Spectre. There are a bunch of other, things the Spectre does really, really well that the Gate doesn't do really, really well. But, like, in terms of reasons I'd buy one, yeah, those are my sort of spot.
And we'll come back to, like, the upgrades in a little bit, but I think that's part of understanding the expectations for the airsoft gun that you just bought, right? Like, you are not buying a real gun, you're buying a toy, and as a consequence of that, if you go and you try and use it in semi-auto like you can a real gun, if you're watching, Flannel Daddy or any other shooting instructors or anything like Pat McNamara or Bob Keller or whomever, you're watching them shoot and manipulate their rifles. If you just try and take your $250 airsoft gun and do the same thing like stock, it's just not capable of doing that, right? So you need to manage that expectation. Just like if you're going to the field and you've bought an airsoft gun and you think you're going to be murking dudes 250 feet away with your stock airsoft gun, I have news for you. Like, it is not going to happen, right? It might happen, like, occasionally on some, like, off chance, freak chance, whatever, but you're consistently not going to be coming up on target against people at 250 feet and getting them every single time. And I can say that with confidence because that doesn't happen to me. And my gun is like 5 times the cost of a stock airsoft gun.
Yeah, like our guns are pretty close to being as upgraded as you can make an airsoft gun. With mostly good beneficial things and a few irritations for me. But the result is that, yeah, like if you are 150 feet away, I am going to hit you pretty much every time I shoot at you, unless you're behind something, right? If you are 200 feet away, I have a decent chance of hitting you when I shoot at you. 250 feet, man, I live in Newfoundland. There's wind here all the time. Like,
Yeah.
The amount of adjustment I have to do to get a single shot to hit you at 250 feet with my airsoft gun, like even when I was running a DMR spring in it and I'm running a longer barrel and all that good stuff, like I can hit him. I can hit him first round, but it's not a matter of skill. It's a matter of like, oh, look, that BB actually went where I wanted it to. Cool.
Yeah. So that's part of, tempering your expectations, right? So you have a toy gun. You can't use it like a real gun because it's just not designed to function that way. And then the other piece is you also, need to understand what it's capable of doing for you on the field, right? It can shoot really fast, no question. Most stock guns can shoot on full auto just as fast, if not faster, than many real steel guns, right? So you can put a lot of BBs downrange. And if you have a high cap and stuff, you can likely keep that going for for an extended period of time.
And there are mechanical benefits there from an airsoft point of view. Like firing an airsoft gun on auto a lot is actually making it work way less hard than firing it a lot on semi.
Yeah. The other thing to consider is, have some expectations around like what might happen with your gun when you do a lot of this stuff. So we talked about like semi-auto locking, for example. The other thing that will happen, your motor will get hot, right? You may find that if you're shooting on semi a lot or because of the start stop and all this kind of stuff, your motor will start to get hot. Or if you just put it up on full auto and just crank like 500 rounds through it in one trigger pull, your motor.
Please don't do that.
Please don't do that. Yeah, no, definitely. But your motor will start to get hot, and that's a real thing, right? And should you be concerned about that? Maybe not.
If you're shooting on semi for like, just huge amounts of shots for like 4 hours without any breaks, then you're playing a really weird game of airsoft, and maybe you should give your motor some time to cool off. It does mean that, like, we've talked about this in some of the tech videos, that your motor brushes will wear out sooner. But, like, if your motor is hot enough that your handguard is warm, your grip is warm, whatever. If you're using an M4 and it starts to feel, like, hot to the touch, stop. But, like, also, how much have you been shooting? Jesus.
Yeah.
And, like, I gave a guy a gun back at one point, and he was very new to airsoft, and he was like, oh, I want you to do some upgrades. So I did the upgrades. And I still stand by the work I did on this gun. But I gave it to him, and like 5 hours later, he called me and he's like, hey, my gun stopped working. What the hell? And I'm like, oh, that's super weird. What have you been doing? He's like, well, I've shot 6,000 rounds through it in the 2.5 hours since I talked to you. And I'm like, okay, I found the problem.
Yeah.
Right? Like, this dude basically just took it home and held down auto for 2 hours. And it's like, well, your gun is not going to handle that. My gun won't handle that. Phil's gun won't handle that. I do stand by like the quality of my shim jobs and stuff, but the parts, the grease using, like 6,000 rounds is, like half a season of play.
And again, this comes down to like airsoft guns are not meant to be used in that way. Can you put 6,000 rounds through a real steel gun? Yeah, absolutely. Can you do that in airsoft? You can too, but like even, there are mechanical limitations, right? And even a real steel gun, like I've seen like that channel on YouTube where the guys just like destroy AKs and other platforms by just putting like 900 rounds through it in the span of like 5 minutes or whatever, and the barrel catches fire and stuff. Like there's mechanical failures. It's a huge amount of stress. And so if you do the same thing in airsoft, like you will start to see that stress, and like your parts will wear down, like your hop up rubbers and like all that stuff. Like none of that is permanent. Eventually it will wear down, and you need to be aware of that too, right? And the sad reality is that, especially when you're starting out, you would expect that you buy a gun and it will work fine for the first year, let's say.
Absolutely.
But depending on how much you play and depending on the manufacturer of that gun, you may not get that much time out of it before something goes wrong, right?
And I mean, it's one of the rough parts is that, you know, even with the better manufacturers, the quality control on stock airsoft guns isn't necessarily what we might sort of air quotes want, right?
Yeah,
So
that's an understatement.
reasonably speaking, if you're playing like every weekend and you're playing, you know, a 3 hour or 4 hour game with the amount of break time that you know it seems typical here and elsewhere, you should expect your stock gun that you bought this season to last you a season or two without breaking. Really, like, you know, that's reasonable. But it's not always going to happen. You know, sometimes, unfortunately, you'll get the one that the quality control was a little skewed in the direction you really didn't want, and oh yeah, I got, you know, 2 games out of it, 3 games out of it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this is a benefit to buying new, because typically, if you bought new, you bought from someone, you can talk to them and be like, hey, I ran this for 2 games and it stopped working, and they'll probably try to do something for you. And I really feel they should at that point. But if you run an airsoft gun for a season and it still works, awesome. 2 seasons, even better. But like by season 3 or season 4 of play, like year 4 of owning this airsoft gun and playing with it, you know, every week, every second week, you know, if you're live where we do, taking the winters off, it's going to get worn out, right? The parts just can't withstand being used forever, and you should expect to have to either learn to or pay someone to tidy it up, right?
Yeah.
The nice thing is that if you keep it stock and it's not shooting super hard and you're not like just running it, you know, a crazy amount, shooting a crazy amount of rounds through it, it will hold up longer generally. But there's nothing you can do about some of the other stuff. The semi-auto, yeah, that's gonna happen to it, right? Year 4 of firing your M4, I don't care if you bought a Crytek. You can spend $1,000 on the best stock airsoft gun in the world, and unless it has a electronic trigger and has replaced that part, that's gonna happen.
Yeah, for sure. So that I think that brings us into the next part. Is like, well, when do you upgrade, right? Like when you're looking at your airsoft gun, when do you decide to upgrade it? And I think we've talked about it in the previous episode, but like sometimes, you know, you can certainly upgrade, but in other cases, maybe it's time to buy a new one, right? Because especially if you bought, let's say, a cheaper entry level model, maybe you do want to go and spend a little bit more money on something that has a decent body, or something that is more rugged or from a better manufacturer or whatever, right? So maybe you started off with like a G&G Raider or whatever, and those are fine, right? But like now you want to go and you want to spend a little bit more money and get that Crytek or whatever, right? Or I mean, I know a lot of people talk really highly about VFC, for instance, right? Now, I haven't had any like good experiences or bad experiences myself, but like, yeah, they're more expensive. So maybe you want to do that, right?
And one of the things you should keep in mind, so I haven't taken apart a Crytek that I remember, which doesn't mean it hasn't happened, just that I'm old and forgetful. I have worked on VFC guns. I've worked on a whole bunch of other brands. I'll tell you for free, the mech box inside is basically the same. Like if you crack a G&P stock mech box, a G&G stock mech box, and a VFC stock mech box next to one another, you're not going to be wowed by the internal component quality on any of them. You're just not. It's unfortunate, but you're not going to be like, oh man, I love this. This one's so much nicer. Mm-hmm. They're all made out of pot metal. Like the actual gearbox shell is basically made out of cheese. They all have gears that are probably steel, that are good enough. They all have shim jobs that are, yeah, we did this in a factory. You know, the factory says put 6 of these on each side, and we did, and it went out the door. The quality upgrade that you get with a lot of them, unless the gun says, oh, you know, comes with specifically upgraded internals. I know Crytek does actually have some guns under their brand that are like, this gun comes with better gears. Cool. You know, this gun comes with an actual trigger replacement MOSFET. Awesome. Right? Mm-hmm. You're paying for the body. You're paying for higher quality externals, right? So, you know, for a really long while, I used a Classic Army, and it was a huge pain in the ass for one specific reason. I loved it. It was fantastic, right? I used it for like 5 years. But it's not one-to-one with other airsoft stuff, it's made a little bigger, and so you can't use non-classic army externals on a classic army gun. They don't line up right. Like you can use a foregrip or an optic or whatever because they just fit on. But like,
Yeah.
you can't use you can't just buy a rail set and mount it, or at least you couldn't when I was using classic army guns, and it was a pain. But they're very solid guns, right? Like there was no creak or wobble. It was a excellent body to use. Your VFC, same thing. Your GNP, absolutely, right? We talk a lot about King Arms because their bodies do what we want them to, and work with the parts we want them to. But ultimately, most of the time when you're paying for a better quality airsoft gun, you're buying metal furniture and better manufacturing for the external components. You're not really getting a lot better internal performance. You will with like stuff like the G&G Raiders. You'll see even within G&G, when you bump up in price point, you eventually move away from their plastic hop-up units, and those are just garbage. They're really, really bad. If you're running one of those, go spend the $20 on a metal hop-up unit and put it in. You'll see an immediate improvement in actual demonstrable quality of performance with just that part. Like I've run a Raider, right? I didn't ever own one, but I've played games with them. They're fun. They're fine. They work. If you're in your first 12 months of playing Airsoft and you have a Raider, great, rock it. If you're playing exclusively with a bunch of people like us who have really upgraded guns, you'll probably start to notice that there are some performance gaps for you. But that's a factor of what my team are all running. And you'd notice that genuinely, right? If you were to come grab a CM16 Raider and just show up and play against exclusively my team, there will be a point where you're okay, I'm getting to the point where I feel good at this game, where I feel that my skills are adequate, but my gun isn't.
Yeah. And I think that's an important distinction because if you are on your second game of ever playing Airsoft, and let's say you didn't come from any other shooting sport, you just picked up Airsoft or whatever, it doesn't matter what Airsoft gun you're using, that gun is better than you, period. Yep. Right? That gun is better than you at Airsoft. Done. And you need to understand that, and you need to be aware of that, because if you're going to the field, and we've said this in previous episodes, but if you're hitting the field and you think, oh, I'm losing because of my gun, and it's your second game, you're not. You're losing because you're not very good at this, because you've literally just started. And there's no shame in that. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that, oh, well, you're a noob and you suck. It's well, the reality is, if you've done something 2 times, you are not good at that. I don't care what it is, whether it's frying a steak at home or whether it's going bowling or it's playing Airsoft. You've done it twice, you suck at it. That's how it is. Unless you're some sort of Airsoft prodigy, which, I ostensibly can exist. I've never seen one, but that's the reality. So when you're starting out, your gear is not holding you back. So eventually, though, as Pat was just saying, there will come a point where you're okay, hang on, I feel like I should be doing better than I am. And that's the point where you start to think, okay, well, maybe at this point my gear is holding me back. And that's when you can start looking at your gun and seeing, hey, hang on. So all of these other guns that I keep seeing, trigger response is really snappy, or they've got, they're outranging me all the time now by 25 to 50 feet. And it's meaningful because I'm moving around, but I'm still getting hit all the time. All that kind of stuff. You're okay, my fundamentals are good, but I'm still losing. That's when you can start to think about, okay, well, maybe I'm in a position that I need to start looking at an upgrade.
And I think it's worth noting, our previous statement of, Phil, when we started this episode off, said, go buy things that you think are cool. Upgrades are definitely cool, right? I'm definitely a tech nerd as far as the airsoft stuff goes. I enjoy tinkering with guns. I enjoy building cool guns. I enjoy using guns that I've upgraded and that other people have upgraded to see what theirs do and how mine match up. If you're looking at this and going, man, but I really want to put a Type 4 barrel in, do it.
Yeah.
It'll improve the performance of your gun. Have fun. Do it up. But we're trying to answer sort of when do I need to start putting performance upgrades in? When do I need to start doing things to change the way my gun works? So the answer is sort of a mixture of when you start really feeling, man, I need to upgrade my gun. You'll know, okay, you should upgrade your gun. If you have been playing Airsoft for a month, unless you have cash to burn, in which case, do whatever. Don't go spend $400 upgrading your airsoft gun. Don't go buy a Spectre FET and get someone to put it in, and go buy every other part you can put in. Like I've had people pay me to do that. Some of whom were not playing for very long. But if you're just a month in, don't do it. And I'd tell you that if you came to me and offered me money to do the service for you. If you've been playing for a year and you're like, man, I really love this, and I have $1,000 that I want to dump into my airsoft gun. Okay, cool. Because, like Phil's definitely right when he says that, like your gun's not what's holding you back. Like a year in, if you are running a stock M4, and it has a metal hop-up, like if you've bought a G&G Raider and you've just put a metal hop-up unit into it, you're not better than your gun. Sorry. But if you are sort of, 6 months in or 4 months in, you're still in the honeymoon phase, right? You're like, oh my God, this is the coolest thing ever. And again, if you have the money to blow and it's not like costing you anything, great. If you're a kid and it's like, well, this is what I've saved up for and this is what I'm loving, do it. When I was 15, that was Warhammer.
Yeah.
Right?
Spoiler alert, it's still Warhammer.
Shh. You're not wrong, but shh. But like, if you are into, mountain biking, you want a good mountain bike when you're a kid, cool, great.
Yeah.
If you are a university student, right, and you're like, oh man, I'm going to have to eat ramen for the next like 6 weeks and get scurvy in order to purchase the upgrades that I want for my airsoft gun, rethink that anyway. But like, if you're 6 months into playing airsoft, be chill.
And you could just say that about any hobby, right? Like you think about someone who's just, I talked about this in the last episode, but like if you just picked up a new musical instrument that you are learning to play, you're not going to go spend you can if you've got the money to burn, but if you go and you buy, like you just started picking up guitar and like you're just learning, you don't need to go and drop $2,000 on a Les Paul Studio Custom like I learned to play on because that's what my teacher had. I would never have spent that money. In fact, the first guitar that I bought for myself was like $150, $200, like something super cheap, and I had like a very small amplifier, and that was fine because I don't need anything else because I don't know anything about anything. It's the same thing if you're, like Pat was just saying, mountain biking. Like if you've just learned to do mountain biking and you're on your second ride, you're not going to go drop $2,000 on a really nice mountain bike at your local custom bike shop. Like you're just going to use whatever you have, and then you're going to learn because you're not out riding the bike that you're on until you've learned a lot more other stuff, right? So like, again, if you have the money, that's fine. But for the average person, you will likely need more time to get the maximum use out of the thing that you're using. Now, on the flip side of that, it is true that when you are abutting against some of the limitations of your gear, that can be frustrating. So if you are hitting the field and your gun is locking on semi all the time and you want to be pulling that trigger all the time and it keeps locking on you, that can be frustrating. So then the question becomes, okay, well, if I buy a better stock gun, is that problem going to go away? Or do I have to do something about it? Or does it really matter? Like, does my frustration prevent me from having fun? If the answer is yes, then you should absolutely do something about it, right? If you're coming off the field and you're like, if I don't figure this out, I'm going to quit airsoft forever.
Yeah, that's definitely a time to be. You should have been looking at the problem before you reached that point, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. But then again, like to Pat's point, if this is your third game or your fourth game or whatever, and you're really frustrated by this fix, the solution is not necessarily to go drop $400 to fix it. There are other things you can be considering, like intermediate fixes, let's call them.
Absolutely. In airsoft, really, like it is very much it's more about the player than the gear anyway. I would rather have a player with a stock gun who is doing the things I need a player or want a player on my team to do to support me than have a player with a really, really upgraded gun who's not doing that.
Yeah.
So I think ultimately, like it's weird because I'm a gun tech. At the end of the day, I would rather you focus on like what you can do with what you have and try to grow into what you've got and then work on upgrades than just dive into upgrading it unless you think that's fun. Mm-hmm. And there's this sort of like, really the question we've been getting asked is, when should I upgrade? Like as though there were a point where it's like, yeah, no, you need to do this. There isn't. There is no point at which it's like, yeah, you absolutely have to upgrade your gun. It's sort of more touchy-feely than that. It's, when do you start to get annoyed by the performance of your gun? When do you start to feel like, I could be doing better if my gun were better? But I know you'll feel like that day one, right? Because you'll be like, oh my God, like I used, if you play here, right? And you're like, oh, I checked out Pat's gun because he's, like, yeah, shoot some people with it, whatever, have fun. And now I want that gun. Awesome. But like, give it some time before you decide to drop that kind of money.
Yeah,
right?
for sure. I guess the only other caveat is like, if your gun breaks, then you should consider whether it's time for you to upgrade your stuff as part of the repair process, right? So, for example, if your gun, let's say that your mech box were to lock completely, and you keep pulling the trigger and you strip your gears, right? So then you need to open your gearbox and you need to replace the gears. Should you be putting OEM gears in there, or should you be looking to put upgraded, harder gears in there? Well, firstly, it'll depend on your budget, but let's assume budget is really not a huge issue for you. You've got a little bit of money to spare. Absolutely, right? You should be looking to upgrade what you have in there from stock because you have the opportunity to do so. But that's not the same scenario as saying game 2, my gun kind of is not doing what I wanted to, so I got to put some new stuff in there. Like Pat was saying, in that situation, yeah, you should be thinking about, well, maybe I can just deal with it and learn the sport a bit more before I put a bit more money. But if you have a failure, and like a mechanical failure, and it's time to repair, it's going to be very hard for you to convince myself or Pat or anybody else that when you have a failure, you shouldn't be looking to replace the parts with better parts, right?
Absolutely. I think that given that, generally speaking, techs are charging you for the time it takes to take your gun apart and do whatever you're doing to it, plus the parts, or you're providing the parts. A stock set of gears and a SHS upgraded gear set like the ones that we use cost about the same amount of money. For the sake of the $3 in price difference, give or take, maybe $5 in price difference, get the good gears. The tech's gonna like putting them in better anyway. Like he's gonna be less annoyed by the process.
Yeah.
If you're paying someone to crack open your gun, I would do as much as you can afford to do at the time with it if you're thinking you want to upgrade it, because it's just easier, right? You've already paid someone to open it up. You've already paid someone to work on it. They're not going to charge you hugely more to do the rest of the work, right? Taking an airsoft gun apart and putting the parts back into it versus taking your airsoft gun apart and putting the new parts into it is not a huge amount of additional effort. Sorry to any gun techs who've been, charging people a ton for that. But really,
it's reality though. And like the truth is, like, I'm relatively competent at disassembling and reassembling my gearbox. I've done it a few times under adult supervision. And Pat is very, very good at doing it. And that being said, we don't want to do that all the time. Like, I could buy a new part for my gearbox, open it up, put it in, close it, and then buy another part and open it and close it, and buy a third part and then open it and close it. Like, I could do that. I've got the skill, and Pat would certainly would certainly help me. He wouldn't support me in doing that because it's stupid. Like, you should really just do it as little as possible because it is finicky. Like, it's not something that is, it can be frustrating at times too. So like, yep. Like Pat was saying, if you have the opportunity and, budget is not an issue, if you're cracking open that gearbox, you should do as much as possible in that what time, right? It's like, getting your car fixed or whatever. Like, you bring it to the mechanic, do as much as you can. I don't want to be back here in like 2 weeks, right?
And like, even if you're the sort of person who enjoys working on cars, right? You tinker, but you're not taking the entire engine out of the thing every weekend, right? It's a significant amount of time. So like, I don't want to spend 7 hours a week doing gun tech work, generally speaking, on my own gear or anyone else's, unless I'm getting paid quite handsomely. Because it's just like, I have shit I want to do for fun that's not working on airsoft guns. I do enjoy it, but it's not the only thing I want to do with my time.
Exactly.
We're all in like the same boat there, I guess, or at least Phil and I are both in the same boat there. But yeah, I mean, if you have the skill set and the inclination, dribbling parts as you can afford them into your gun will give you increased performance over time as you go. But I don't think it's efficient, and especially because, parts wise, aside from the Spectre FET, the full upgrade package for internals that we're all running is like 120 Canadian. So save your money up and just buy it the once, really.
Yeah, and I think this ties again neatly into the next point, or one of the latter points that we wanted to make, which is really that when you are, especially when you're a beginner, if you tell me, hey, my gun locks on semi, how do I fix this problem? I will tell you the best way to fix that problem, and that is put a Spectre FET in your gun and take out the mechanical parts that causes failure, and you will never have that problem again. However, you may not want to do that. Well, firstly, you may not be able because Spectres aren't in stock right now as we record this because it's a huge pain to get them. But so you may not be able to, number one. And number two, you may not have the budget, right? Because it's expensive, right? You may not want, as a beginner, to say, I just bought this gun like 3 days ago. I don't want to spend $400 to upgrade this gun. That's legit. You don't want to do that. So what can you do in the interim? Well, you can switch it to full and work around the problem. Or, like we were saying earlier, you can look at intermediate steps. And I think in that case, it's really worth considering whether you'll be okay with the intermediate step in terms of the cost and the time, and understanding that you will likely be back here in the same place in 6 months to a year, or whether you just decide to make that investment. But as a beginner, you need to understand that there are more options than the best option, but people who've been doing this a while will generally tell you not to waste your time with intermediate steps.
And so, like, if we talk about Phil's gun over time, we replaced a couple of cutoff levers in his gun. We replaced one with just a spare one we had around that was less worn, and it helped with the problem for a while. We replaced it with a steel, like, tempered, super nice one, and it helped with the problem for longer. As I noted earlier, the issue is partly caused by the cycle not being completed when you pull the trigger. So if you upgrade your motor, then it cycles quicker, right? It's snappier. If you put a electronic FET of some sort in there, in between the trigger and the motor, it makes it work more efficiently. It makes it work quicker. So you can get the problem minimized a lot, right? Before I put the Spectre FET into my current build, the previous build still had the Trigger Master that was the first MOSFET I ever bought, because it did everything I needed it to. It was great. It was a slight pain in the ass to program by comparison. Actually, it was a huge pain to program by comparison to the Bluetooth Spectres, but like that's another thing. But it did everything I wanted it to. And yeah, every now and then it locked up on semi. One in every 200 shots or something. And I went, oh, that sucks, and switched to full auto and probably shot someone with a burst and then went back to shooting on semi, whatever. You can train that out really easily. Especially when you get to the point where oh, my gun didn't just stop working, it just had a minor fault that's easily corrected without opening it, right? New players are like, oh my god, is it broken? No, it's not broken. Great. But like, I think I'm less easily frustrated by that issue than Phil, right? By the specific semi-locking issue that we're talking about than Phil. And I'm still super glad that it will never happen again.
For sure. And I think ultimately, though, it comes down to understanding what the root cause of your problem is, right? And the root cause of this, sort of to close the loop completely on this, is that airsoft guns are toys. And mechanically on the inside, they suck. That's how it is, right? The factories that make them look nice on the outside, and on the inside, they use essentially the cheapest parts that they can get away with. Unless you're specifically, again, buying a kind of gun that comes and it's marketed to being like, yes, it comes with internal upgrades, it comes with better gears, it comes with a MOSFET, an electronic trigger unit, it comes with a better spring, all this kind of stuff, right? Unless it's marketed like that, they're using the cheapest thing that they can get away with, because it's not about the inside, it's about the fact that they're trying to build a cool looking toy. And the way that the gearbox works and the way that the electronic circuit inside works, using like the mechanical shuttle and stuff, that's not great. Like, that's prone to its own issues. Ultimately, if you look at any problem that you're having, you have to trace it back to the root cause. And for us, the root cause is the mechanical components suck, so you take them out and it becomes a non-issue. Done, and you can move on. But when you're a beginner, you may not want to do that after your third game or your third week or whatever, right? And that's fine.
And so a thing I want to mention, because I think it's pretty important to mention here, and I've sort of alluded to this previously. I don't think I've said it as explicitly as I'm about to. So the little unit that actually runs your airsoft gun, the gearbox, is a little air compressor that has been tortured and shrunken into the most bizarre, useless shape imaginable so that it can do specifically the thing we want it to do. It is analogous to like dog breeding and getting a pug, right? Like we wanted it to do very specific things. Look at what we've created. That isn't necessarily health-wise the best for the thing we've created, right? So, and I'm not hating on pugs. They're great dogs. They're just prone to a bunch of health issues. So, like, I have an air compressor that I use to run an airbrush. It is functionally the same thing as an airsoft gun, right? It's running at a different sort of volume, but it's basically the same idea. I can run it for a couple hours, just turn it on. It gets hot after an hour of airbrushing, but like it's designed to be okay with that. It's designed to radiate heat so that it can keep working. Airsoft guns are, the compressor in my airsoft gun shoots way more air pressure per shot and is vastly smaller. So not only are these toys being made with the cheapest components available that will sort of work, but they're already a complicated feat of engineering in terms of just fitting a thing that does what we want it to inside of something that looks like a gun.
Yeah.
And so one of the hardest things about talking to people about like what they want in terms of tech work done is going, look, like the laws of physics, unfortunately, are not things I can violate, right?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it will always be a toy gun. The best performance metrics you can possibly imagine are not going to make it into the M4 you're used to using in Call of Duty.
Yeah, that's right. Or that you've seen used by, shooting instructors and like, YouTube personalities and stuff like that. They in form, they might look similar, but their function is vastly different. And, it's hard to grasp at, especially when you're a beginner. But it's really, really important. What we've really talked about today is making sure that you have the right expectations around your gear and how it's going to work. And we haven't really talked about like your tactical gear or like your load bearing equipment and stuff, but the same sort of general principles apply. Like when you're buying airsoft, replicas, you're not getting the same quality as the real deal. And so consequently, it's more prone to failure. We'll talk about that probably in a future episode. But really hard to understate the importance of understanding the limitations of your gear, because that will also lead to less frustration for you, right? If you're going out there expecting that your gear is going to perform a certain way and it doesn't, that sucks. Whereas if you really understand what is likely to happen when you hit the field, then that mitigates the frustration when if and when it eventually does happen. If you know that your gun can lock on semi when you're shooting semi a whole lot because it's a stock gun, and then it does, you're like, oh yeah, I knew that was going to happen. As opposed to not being aware of it and being like, oh my God, what the hell? My gun is broken already and it's 2 days.
And it's especially important, really, not that we thought about it before this, but it's important for us to be telling you this because we advocate in all of our videos and all of our content for shooting in semi. And for reasons that I think are correct and good and sufficient. And you can go look into them when you're not listening to this specific podcast episode.
Yeah.
But I think it is probably important for us to tell you, and maybe in this case a bit belatedly, maybe we should have thought of it sooner, but that happens. To tell you that, yeah, if you're shooting a lot on semi and your gun is stock, it will do this every now and then. It's not a big deal.
So guys, that's really what we wanted to cover today with respect to, again, tips for beginners. Next time we touch this subject, we'll really go more into like the details of like gear and like how to select the right gear and when it's time to go from one piece to the other. And again, we're not saying that, you can't try stuff that you find fun, but we're talking about, as always, what is going to give you, the best performance, especially as you're a beginner. And specifically for us, what we consider are essential pieces of kit that you really need to be looking into, even pretty early on in your airsoft career, let's say. But I mean, until then, don't really have anything else for you. So thank you so much for listening. If you haven't checked us out on Discord yet, the link is in the description. We'd love to have the conversations with you. Come join us. Tell us about your first experiences. We can't wait to hear from you.
Absolutely, guys. Thanks so much for tuning in, and hopefully we'll talk to you on Discord soon.
Cheers.